Picture gas hitting $4 a gallon one morning, $6 by the next day, and $7 by the end of the week, with every answer to why it happened tracing back to a swarm of low-flying drones crossing a Saudi desert in the dead of night. That scenario is not theoretical because it already played out and the world barely registered what had occurred. Today, we are covering Iranian and Houthi attacks on Saudi oil infrastructure. What actually happened in September 2019, how global markets nearly cracked open inside 48 hours, and what all of it means now that the Middle East is once again pushing toward the edge. If you're learning something here, please hit subscribe. Many of you are aware of what's been happening with the channel. If you feel like supporting, a link in the description. I spent months researching what's coming between 2026 and 2030, and I put it all into an ebook called The Next Global Shift: How to Stay Ahead of Economic Collapse and War, the Economies, the Conflicts, the Moves You Need to Make. If you want my ebook, link in the description. Let's get into it. Number one, you need to understand what Saudi Arabia actually is in the global energy picture. Most people treat it as a wealthy desert kingdom, and that description isn't wrong, but it completely misses the deeper story, which is about concentration and vulnerability. Saudi crude oil exports in 2023 came in at over 310 billion US, and that figure represented roughly 16% of the entire planet's oil trade revenue in a single year. One country controlling 16% of global crude exports means that whatever happens inside Saudi Arabia's borders gets felt at gas stations from Los Angeles to New York within days. The kingdom also produces roughly 9.7 million barrels of oil per day, placing it alongside the United States and Russia as one of the top 3 producers on Earth. But the volume isn't the real vulnerability. The real vulnerability is where all that oil has to travel through before it reaches anyone. And that brings us to a facility most Americans have never heard of called Abqaiq, operated by Saudi Aramco. Abqaiq functions as the main crude oil processing and stabilization plant for the entire kingdom. And the way to understand its weight is straightforward. Oil pulled straight from the ground is not export ready because it carries gas. It sits chemically unstable and no tanker captain will load it in that condition. Every barrel leaving Saudi Arabia for the world market runs through Abqaiq first to get cleaned up and made stable for shipping. That single facility processes roughly 7 million barrels per day, which works out to approximately 7% of all global crude oil production capacity, sitting behind one set of fences in the eastern desert. And then there's Ras Tanura, Saudi Arabia's largest export terminal, where stabilized crude gets loaded onto ships and dispatched to buyers across the planet. Ras Tanura moves roughly 6.5 million barrels a day, handles about 90% of Saudi hydrocarbon exports, and carries around 7% of total global oil demand flowing through a single port. Once you absorb those two numbers, the reason Iran and its allies have had those two locations circled on a map for years becomes obvious. On September 14th, 2019, someone tested that vulnerability with results the world had never seen before. In the early morning hours, a coordinated strike hit both the Abqaiq complex and the Karish oil field simultaneously, and Saudi officials reported that 18 drones struck Abqaiq, while 4 cruise missiles slammed into Karish, with 3 additional missiles aimed at Abqaiq falling short of their target. What elevated the strike beyond its scale was its precision at Abqaiq. The drones located and destroyed 11 spheroid separation tanks, the specific structures responsible for separating gas from crude oil during the stabilization process. And that kind of targeting requires detailed knowledge of the facility's internal layout. Whoever planned this understood Saudi Aramco's infrastructure in considerable depth. The result was that 5.7 million barrels per day of Saudi production went dark in a single night, roughly half the kingdom's total output and between 5 and 6% of the entire world's daily oil supply gone at once. Analysts described it as the single largest sudden disruption of oil supplies in recorded history, bigger than what global markets absorbed when Iraq invaded Kuwait in 1990, and bigger than the loss of Iranian oil during the 1979 revolution. One attack in one night broke a record that had stood for decades. The market's reaction in those first 48 hours is something every American with a retirement account should understand, because it shows exactly how exposed the global economy is to a single point of failure in a Saudi desert. When markets opened on Monday, September 16th, 2019, the first full trading day after the attack, Brent crude shot up nearly 20% 20% in early trading, which represented the largest intraday spike in dollar terms since that contract launched back in 1988. By the close, Brent settled around $69 a barrel, still up about 14 to 15% on the day. And the American benchmark, West Texas Intermediate, jumped somewhere between 10 and 15%, its biggest single-day percentage gain since 2008. Analysts at Goldman Sachs and elsewhere began warning that a prolonged outage could push Brent well above $75, and the conversation about $100 oil started within hours. And that's when investors began moving money into gold, the Japanese yen, and US treasuries, which is the classic fear trade, meaning that markets weren't just repricing oil, they were repricing global stability itself. What nobody expected was the speed of Saudi Arabia's recovery. By September 17th, 3 days after the attack, APCA was already processing roughly 2 million barrels per day again. And by late September, total Saudi output capacity climbed back to about 11.3 million barrels per day, with Abqaiq contributing around 4.9 million and K running at roughly 1.3 million. More than 75% of the lost production returned within a single week. Prices retraced, and most Americans went back to their lives without ever really understanding what those 48 hours had demonstrated. And this is where the story gets genuinely complicated, because the question of who carried out the attack has never been cleanly settled. Yemen's Houthi movement, also known as Ansar Allah, claimed responsibility on the morning of September 14th, with a Houthi spokesperson asserting the strike deployed 10 drones and warning that future operations would expand and be more painful as long as the aggression and siege continue. The United States and Saudi Arabia rejected that account almost immediately. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo declared publicly that this was an unprecedented attack on the world's energy supply, stated that Tehran is behind nearly 100 attacks on Saudi Arabia, and insisted there was no evidence the attacks came from Yemen at all. US and Saudi officials presented satellite imagery and missile debris and argued the attack's apparent trajectory ran from the north or northeast rather than from Yemen to the south, with the weapons identified as Iranian-made systems beyond anything the Houthis were known to operate. Iran came back with a flat denial, calling the accusations part of a maximum deceit campaign designed to justify American pressure. And Iranian Foreign Minister Mohammad Javad Zarif raised a pointed observation. If Riyadh truly believed Iran was responsible, Saudi Arabia had retaliated against Houthi-held territory in Yemen rather than striking Iran directly. Then in December 2019, a United Nations report delivered under Secretary General Antonio Guterres stated that investigators were unable to independently corroborate that the cruise missiles and unmanned aerial vehicles used in these attacks are of Iranian origin. And that same report noted the Houthis had not been shown to possess the specific long-range drone systems used that morning. 3 parties claiming or denying responsibility, and the United Nations unable to confirm any of it. That is where the official record still rests. But the September 2019 attack didn't emerge from nowhere, and the broader pattern behind it carries more weight than any single attribution debate. Since Saudi Arabia entered the Yemen conflict in March 2015, the Houthi movement has run a relentless campaign of missile and drone strikes against Saudi territory, and the Center for Strategic and International Studies documented more than 250 confirmed attacks on Saudi targets over a 3-year period. That same analysis found that Houthi strikes on predominantly civilian targets inside Saudi Arabia doubled in the first 9 months of 2021 compared to the same period in 2020. None of that capability came from inside Yemen on its own. Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, specifically the Quds Force, along with Lebanese Hezbollah, supplied the weapons, delivered the technical training, and embedded advisors inside the Houthi structure. And the strategic logic reads clearly once you understand the geography. By enabling the Houthis to threaten Saudi oil infrastructure, Iran can keep pressure on Riyadh and on global markets, while Tehran maintains enough distance to avoid direct military confrontation. The pattern also showed up 4 months before Abqaiq, when on May 14, 2019, Houthi drones struck 2 of Saudi Aramco's oil pumping stations on the east-west pipeline and temporarily shut down flows, which meant that September's attack wasn't improvised. It was the next next step in a campaign that had been building steadily for years. What happened in 2023 added a completely different layer to the story, and it came from an unexpected direction after 7 years of severed diplomatic relations dating back to January 2016, when Saudi Arabia cut ties with Iran following attacks on Saudi missions by Iranian protesters after the execution of Shiite cleric Nimr al-Nimr. The two countries reached an agreement in Beijing on March 10, 2023. Iran's top security official Ali Shamani and Saudi National Security Advisor Must bin Mohammed Ali Ban signed the deal brokered by China's senior diplomat Wang Yi, who called it a triumph for dialogue and peace. China's reason for stepping in as mediator wasn't philosophical. Beijing imports considerable amounts of Gulf oil, and the last thing China needed was Saudi Arabia and Iran fighting over the infrastructure that keeps Chinese industry running. So Beijing moved to stabilize the relationship and collected the diplomatic credit for doing it. Analysts at the time noted that Saudi Arabia's implicit expectation was that Iran would restrain Houthi attacks on Saudi energy facilities as part of the new arrangement. A diplomatic handshake, though, doesn't retrain a proxy force that has spent years targeting Saudi infrastructure, and the Houthis remained armed, funded, and operational throughout the normalization process. And that's when everything circles back to where we stand now in 2026, with a broader regional conflict involving Iran heating up again. Reports from early 2026 indicate that Iran has been pushing the Houthis to prepare for renewed attacks on Red Sea shipping and potentially on regional energy infrastructure if the conflict escalates further. And the Houthis have signaled publicly that they stand ready to strike key waterways, including the Bab el-Mandeb Strait. Saudi Arabia has held to a neutral position in the broader Iran conflict so far, but analysts warned that a successful hit on major Saudi assets, specifically Ras Tanura or Red Sea port infrastructure, would almost certainly force Riyadh off the sidelines and directly into the fight. Here is what all of this adds up to. The global oil market carries a concentration problem that most Americans have never had explained to them, where a single facility in a Saudi desert controls 7% of global crude production capacity and a single port handles 7% of global oil demand. And both of those facilities have been successfully targeted before. The 48 hours after the 2019 attack showed exactly how fast that vulnerability translates into prices at the pump and fear across financial markets. The attribution for those attacks remains officially unresolved. The underlying Iran-Saudi rivalry persists beneath the diplomatic surface, and the proxy network Iran built remains intact. The next time you see a headline about oil prices spiking overnight or a drone intercepted over the Gulf, you now have the full picture of what is actually at stake. And none of it is distant foreign policy. All of it connects directly to your gas bill, your grocery prices, and the health of your retirement account. This is not over. This is the video today. I'll see you next.